Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Joseph, it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you, man. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. Thank you very much, Robbie, for this invitation. Delightful to talk with you. My name is Oliver Boyd-Barrett. I am a retired Professor Emeritus in journalism and public relations from Bowling Green State University in Ohio. And also, I am also a Professor Emeritus from California State Polytechnic University in Pomona. I started my life in Dublin in Ireland. I was educated principally in the United Kingdom, and I didn't actually settle in the United States until the end of the 1990s. I have, for the most of my life, I have been an academic. I have worked in a number of different fields, but throughout my life, I have had an interest in the mass media. I started with a book about the international news agencies, such as Associated Press and Reuters and organizations like that. But I have maintained that interest in the media throughout my life, and almost inevitably, if one is seriously interested in how media operate in contemporary society, you have to, by definition almost, you also have to be interested in propaganda. And just over the last 10 years, that has been my principal focus of concern. I have written on the role of media coverage of Russia, of Russiagate, of Syria. My last book was Conflict Propaganda in Syria, Narrative Battles. And I've also written on Hollywood and propaganda as well.
When it comes to Hollywood propaganda, let's start with that because I have a bunch of questions about Associated Press. Media in general is just interesting. I think with podcasters, I'm not a media person at all. I don't want to be associated with that, but everybody gets their news from something, whether it's social media platforms or whether it's news outlets or something else. But when it comes to Hollywood propaganda, I mean, I learned about J. Edgar Hoover's invasion into Hollywood, and you start learning about the things that they were choosing. And I guess you have to put it in the mindset of back then of what the things that were approved of compared to now. But it just had me questioning everything. Like, is every film I watch a propaganda film? And then I remember Lone Survivor. That was like sign up at your local recruitment station, kid. And I mean, I guess it's everywhere you really look.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about films like Lone Survivor in a moment. But you did mention to me that you were particularly interested in JFK and the JFK assassination. It's kind of remarkable. A number of my colleagues in this area of propaganda want to tell a very monolithic story about Hollywood, actually. They want to tell a story which is a true story up to a point about how Hollywood has, for many decades, lent itself out as a propaganda tool to the US foreign policy establishment primarily, and have allowed their scripts to be reviewed by the Pentagon, by the CIA, by other principal agencies in return for a number of striking advantages, such as access to aircraft carriers and large numbers of infantrymen and flashy jet planes and this kind of thing. Material that is quite expensive otherwise to be able to acquire. And it is this kind of flashy stuff that makes some that accounts for the success of many action-packed, action thriller, blockbuster type movies that tend to be very, very popular amongst males in the age range of about 18 to 35 to 40, if you like. It is mainly men, because men tend to be the ones to take their girlfriends or their wives to the movies, or used to, before the streaming age, to the movies on a Friday night or on a Saturday night. And they're the ones, in other words, the young American male who accounted for box office success on the first weekend of release, a phenomenon, a publicity phenomenon, which kind of dictates success of relative success of movies throughout the entire chain of distribution, from theaters through to replays on television and on streaming channels and the like. So I want to, and we need to talk about this because it's very, very important. And anyone who wants to understand films and movies needs to understand how Hollywood lends itself out directly. There's nothing indirect about this whatsoever. Directly for the purposes of mainstream propaganda. However, there is another side to the story as well, and because of your interest in JFK, I don't want to downplay it either. Although by and large, I would say Hollywood has primarily been a somewhat conservative and uncritical supportive machine for American empire, it's not a monolithic conversation by any means. And even if the critical movies are tucked away in the edge of this cinema sphere, they are still very important, sometimes incredibly good movies, and may have an impact far beyond what appears to be the case just by looking at indices of box office success. So the movie that you mentioned, and indeed it was a box office success, or the JFK, I'm referring to the Oliver Stone 1991.
Yeah, I didn't mention the JFK movie. I mentioned the Lone Survivor movie.
Right. Yes, and let's get back to that in a moment. But JFK would be at the opposite end of the scale. So the point I'm trying to make, Robbie, is that yes, let us understand Hollywood as one of many sources of mainstream propaganda, particularly so far as U.S. foreign policy is concerned, and insofar as the U.S. military-industrial complex is concerned. But I think that we should be wary of exaggerating that and denying the industry's potential occasionally to find a radical perspective on matters of huge importance.
I wouldn't use the JFK film as a film as reference on that one, mostly because Oliver Stone's film, he added some things to fantasy it up, but the real actual history based on the House Select Committee on Assassinations investigations and the 60 years almost worth of documents proves that Oswald was an intelligence agency. I can back up the documents that I have about that as well, too. What the AARB went through to be able to prove that. His film had an impact in a sense that it had people write in to their congressmen to get the AARB established to unclassify these documents to prove that. What I would consider a dangerous aspect of Hollywood is when we start talking about a person like Walt Disney. Walt Disney has memos back to Hoover talking about we're just going to insert FBI agents in cartoons with Mickey Mouse so the kids can be introduced to them. That's fine. I think that's okay. I don't see anything wrong with that at all. What got worse was when he was false claiming people that were striking up labor unions against him and having them try and be interrogated by the FBI by labeling them communist. Do I think it's still the climate like that today? No, but when I start looking at Oliver Stone, who's an award-winning filmmaker, he makes another film about JFK, and he has to go overseas to get funding from it from the UK. I bring up questions when there's a guy who makes a documentary about the Russian doping scandal, gets money funded for that for Netflix, but then he makes something about Saudi Arabia, and they don't give him funding for that. I don't like the cherry picking of what we choose to classify. And even now, the mainstream news doesn't talk about the JFK assassination when it comes. I mean, I think just recently, because Mary Farrell sued them for document release, we saw independent news sources like The Hill start mentioning a lot of things about what we did learn. I think, you know, propaganda is not the same today as it was in the 60s, but when it starts coming to an aspect of just the influence of things, I think minor stuff is fine. But I mean, there are some things out there. I mean, I think the whole 50s and 60s brainwashed us to think that, anything red was a communist, and, not what would be better, fighting the Nazis or fighting in Pearl Harbor, the Japanese. I mean, we didn't know about it like that because we're just watching a film, and I guess you advertising tactics, you kind of pick up the, the the hidden message. I would say, I think that's more of a rational example, which would be Walt Disney and the FBI, and other aspects when it comes to Hollywood propaganda.
Yeah, the idea that Hollywood excuse me, lent itself out for propaganda purposes, it's been around for some time, but until relatively recently, very few people had empirical evidence to support their instinctive sense that in many movies they were being got at, so to speak, as targets for U.S. empire propaganda. But now, and I think this is particularly important because we now have a better sense of how it works in the field of Hollywood, and therefore even more reason to suspect that it operates also in the world of other media. Well, we've known that for some time too, as a result of the 1970s various congressional investigations into the role of the CIA and its impact on media. But the 1970s was quite a long time ago. And also the 1970s congressional committees, to my memory, didn't speak so much about the world of fictional media. They spoke more to the world of news media. The presumption was at that time that propaganda was primarily an activity that exerted itself in the world of the news media. So it's taken some while for people to catch up with the fact that possibly it's through the world of fictional media that propaganda has its most enduring and most widespread impact. So what changed? We had for several decades there was one, and this story, by the way, that I can try to summarize very quickly, but let me just put in a mention here of a new documentary. Robbie, I don't know whether you know of it, and you will surely be interested in it. It's a documentary. It's called Theaters of War.
Yeah, I had Matthew Alford on the show. That's his
Yeah.
documentary.
Oh, good. Oh, there you know what about that then. So I think it's largely that documentary tells a story of how eventually we've had evidence that has illuminated the black box. When I say the black box, I mean that sphere of activity that separates the media product, from the process of production. There's something else that intervenes between the production and the product, if you like. And although we've had a lot of suspicions that there was something that got in between these two things, it's only in the last couple of decades that we've actually got the evidence for this. One primary source was it was Matthew Alford himself, of course, and Tom Seeker, and I'm trying to remember a name. Tracy's
Oh, Trisha,
it's in this book somewhere.
Trisha
Yes, perhaps. But we scholars have begun to obtain access to organizations like the CIA liaison office and like the DoD liaison, the entertainment liaison office, which is the Army's uh, um, syringe into Hollywood. So that we actually now have evidence, as you see from that Matthew Alford account in Theatres of War, and Roger Stoll, by the way, also a very significant scholarly name in this field, have found evidence of there being official intervention from the military and from the CIA. Those two seem to be the principal conduits that people have so far researched, but I don't think that can be the end of the story. And they've identified 2,500 movies and television series that have been the subject of DoD or CIA liaison overview for the purposes of collaboration, for the purposes of obtaining access or obtaining resources that would otherwise be extremely difficult for filmmakers to obtain, in return for allowing their scripts to be reviewed and to be modified. So, well, for a number of purposes. One is frequently for the purposes of recruitment, to aid in recruitment. So the Theatres of War documentary makes reference to something that a number of other people have talked about over the years, the role of Top Gun in 1986 as a vehicle for reestablishing the Army's reputation following that low period following the Vietnam War, when the Army was considered to have lost the war and damaged American respect for the United States and so on and so forth. And Top Gun was credited, and there is some empirical evidence to suggest that it actually worked in terms of boosting, providing a magnificent boost to recruitment to the different wings of the U.S. military, just on the basis of telling a story of sexy young people and sexy looking jet planes, and that's kind of what it takes. And if you have a recruitment which actually happened, if you have recruiting desks in the foyer of the theaters, as the young people, and particularly, of course, the young men, flush with the excitement of identifying with all this glamour of weaponry and sharpness and so on and so forth, crisp military suits or uniforms. There they confront the recruiting officer, and they sign up, and it worked magnificently.
Yeah, I had Matthew Alford on here explain all about this and everything. But what are your thoughts on that there? Do you think that if you don't study film and if you don't study propaganda, you're not going to know that this is all that. I didn't know to look for it until I started realizing that there was this influence. And then there's another thing out there as well, too. Bob Herzberg, he made a book called the Bureau on Screen. And he invaded kind of the whole FBI documents about, Pearl Harbor, the movie. When it was released, they had to go to ask Japan and show Japan it. And Japan's like, there's I think a specific scene where someone's getting lit up in the background on one of the ships. And they were like, take that out. You don't need to have that in there. And we said, okay, but we did. I mean, if you watch it, it's not a good picture of of who they are. But there was certain things where Japan was like, you can't have that in there. And it makes sense. I mean, you don't want to piss off a rival country if you make them look bad in a film. I mean, it's obviously you have to look at the historical value in it as well, too. But I mean, it's a film is so I didn't realize the power that it had, and not only to ourselves, but the power it had in overseas. I mean, I think it was there's a movie out, or John Cena is a good example. When his movie Fast and Furious came out, all he said was, I'm excited that Taiwan's going to be the first country to see my film. And China lost their mind. And it was like, what? And he had to apologize in Mandarin, fluent Mandarin. And it was because they don't recognize Taiwan as a country. And it's like, oh my God, you don't realize like what a 20-second clip on your phone could even do.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, the thing is, it's the United States also doesn't recognize Taiwan as a separate country. The official U.S. Foreign policy on China is the one China policy. The United States does not recognize Taiwan as a country that is separate from mainland China. So so you can understand that not that China would have a legitimate grievance about a movie or a movie celebrity not recognizing that fact, and so that brings us into another issue, of another dimension of propaganda, where the media, news media, as well as fictional media, can totally forget uh, something hugely important, such as the fact that you've just mentioned, that Taiwan and China are one nation. Within that concept, you can say there are two camps. You do have the camp that says, well, yes, that the one nation applies to the idea of China that would be governed from Taiwan on the basis of the whether you regard that there was any legitimacy to the invasion of Taiwan by Kai-shek in the 1940s, and but I think that's a minority view, that the government in Taiwan is actually the government of all of China. The current government, the U.S., deeply embedded to the U.S. foreign policy establishment. The current view is that the current Taiwanese government would like to see itself as the government of all of China. But that's I think most people find that thought actually, as they should, totally ridiculous.
Well, the real underlying factor in that is the fact that a celebrity has enough power to accidentally make a slip up of a word and impact foreign policy. I mean, before you had to worry about your newspapers maybe printing an article, but even then, the rivaling country might just print an article about us. There was a different form of it, but now social media has increased the range, I would say, of getting this type of slip ups and mistakes out there. I mean, I don't see America banning the movie Fast and Furious just because John Cena slipped up and recognized Taiwan as a country. But China was like, no, we're not having that. And that just puts more power in not only social media celebrities or celebrities in general, but I see so much on the news from Tucker Carlson and whoever's on CNN that are saying things that are obviously fit to their bias, but I mean, they spent months crapping on Ukraine before Ukraine was even a problem. And then they went the complete opposite way on it.
Yeah, so we're living in very complex times. The basic purposes of propaganda, I would argue, haven't changed very much over the centuries. It's still about promoting certain people or certain causes or certain kinds of government or political parties, or promoting products or business interests, this kind of thing. Or it's about smearing the people that you don't like. Those are the two principal aims of propaganda: glorifying and smearing. Those two things. And then there are lots of different ways in which you can do those two things. And as a result of the social media and the phenomena such as bots and trolls, the whole exercise of propaganda has become a good deal more complicated and interesting in a way than it used to be.
I mean, did it start like when did it start? When did someone realize that you can literally either influence your troops or deter down the others by just a simple poster or a political cartoon? I mean, at one point, Dr. Seuss was trying to strike stones at an establishment or a monolith structure of whatever the Rockefellers, whoever. And it's just like, like who figured that out, that there was a way that you could draw something or you could write something in such a sense that could be, whether it's a smear or not. But I mean, in some cases it works. I heard the positives on it. One thing is there's a book called the virtuous Wehrmacht, I think it's called. And it's about the way that we viewed the German soldiers. Well, back then, the German soldiers would have a little trick of, trying to build churches and do these types of things, and either in Russia or something like that. And the people would think that these are their new saviors. Well, our propaganda was so strong against the Germans that, there's like political cartoons of them shooting us in the back or something, that we didn't buy any of that good, gracious, or maybe they're okay people. We knew to kind of like not believe those tricks. Now, whether you want to consider that bad, still propaganda, in a sense, I mean, it didn't have any things going on, so we were able to win the war. I mean, it was a group effort in that sense, but I think there's weird positives in there and there's negatives, but who figured it out? Who figured out that you can draw something to be able to, change the minds of individuals and strike up resistance?
Well, it goes back a long way, of course, and the Roman Catholic Church invented the modern term propaganda, and actually had a division of propaganda in Rome, whose purpose was to defend the Catholic Church against the revolution that was inspired by Martin Luther and the other Protestant movements. This was
Wait, the church thesis guy?
mm, yes, so, the Catholic Church was challenged by Protestantism. It recognized that its own belief system was being challenged, and it did what all good propaganda organizations will do. It mounted a counter challenge to Protestantism and set up a bureau of propaganda precisely for this purpose. So this is the point at which you find that that Rome is beginning to support orders such as the Jesuits, for example, and supplying them with the spiritual backing, but also some resourcing to spread the message of Roman Catholicism, or the Catholic, the dominant Catholic narrative of Christianity back then, and having the Jesuit order in particular, which is one of the most elite religious orders of the Catholic Church, and still is today, by the way, and sending them out to far off places like Japan and China, where much of the time they encountered failure. But then in other parts of the world, they also achieved, from a Roman point of view, achieved very spectacular success, as in South America and Central America and so on. So yes, and this notion, by the way, of propaganda as an actual practice, whatever you called it, whatever the label given to it was, we can find out going back, I would say, back to the seeds of history, certainly of recorded history. So the building of monuments, as in the pharaohs Egypt, or Egypt with the pharaohs, in the classic civilizations of the Mediterranean, the Greek and the Roman in particular, their glory, so to speak, was constructed with a very conscious awareness of their significance for humbling the masses, impressing the masses of the people, of the power of the regimes that built these temples and administrative buildings and irrigation networks and roads and so on. This was propaganda directed not only to their own people, to their own native supporters, as in the case of Alexander the Great, that would have been his own Greek troops and his own country of Greece, but also even more so, even more important, communicating the power of Alexander and the power of his Greek civilization to all of the countries that they and all the peoples that they conquered up to and beyond modern day Iran, modern day Persia, even to the western provinces of China.
I've never thought of statues before as being propaganda, but I can kind of see it in a sense. A lot of the times they're huge and they're towering over people, and it's either I know it's like, I guess, to maybe show supremacy in a sense. Usually I thought of it as just to the leader wanted that there to admire. But if you look at it as a sign of like a person staring at this giant thing looming over you, it's an oppression aspect. It's like, don't forget who's in charge here. A little bit probably different with Greek gods. I guess that just keeps more of a religious aspect to it. But I mean, kings built multiple statues of themselves. There's one guy on Hadrian's Wall or whatever it is that created a statue for a boy that he loved, and it was just all over the place. There's just these statues.
Yeah, and that continues to this very day. Human beings, I guess, are only too easily impressed um, by colored ribbons and flashy weapons and magnificent skyscrapers and all the rest of it. And we forget to ask ourselves typically, who is it who's doing all of this? Why are they doing it? And why have they got the money to do it? And we have nothing. So propaganda is more to do with the already powerful, because the already powerful tend to have access to the resources of symbology, if you will. Propaganda is largely about the use of symbols. It's playing with nothing to make it look as like something. And we human beings are incredibly susceptible to these kind of mind games. And they've been going on for centuries, but the development of the mass media, the development of the printing press, and then, of course, broadcasting, and then more recently, the internet and digital communication, all of these things have grossly expanded the zones in which it's possible to play propaganda games. Which is not to say, though, that propaganda is always successful or is always effective. As many times as it is not. And we have to kind of find tools for empirical analysis of what are the conditions for effective propaganda, and when is propaganda least likely to be successful or effective. Public relations is a very serious, as you very well know, is a very serious and long established tradition, scientific approach to the study of persuasion and of propaganda. The term public relations itself, however, interestingly, was coined by Edward Bernays, who has a claim to be the founding father of modern public relations. But he tells us in an interview that he and others came up with the term public relations because the idea of propaganda had become converted from the very positive associations it once had, at least in the purview of the Roman Catholic Church, to being a very negative thing following World War One. Bernays was associated with the Creel Committee in World War One, which was the principal organ of U.S. war propaganda against Germany. And the George Creel, shortly after World War One, began to write books about all the mind tricks, mind games they had played with the American public in order to secure U.S. support in this war. And most Americans were absolutely horrified by the extent to which they had been tricked into supporting this truly very gruesome and many people would say totally unnecessary war, certainly from a U.S. point of view.
It's not
They were
even
horrified. So, yeah.
it's I must say it's not even you have to be intelligent to be able to notice it. There's certain things like I've talked to plenty of memory experts and psychologists on this show, and there's that monkey experiment where the people are tossing a basketball back and forth and the monkey walks by and you don't even see it. They're like, pay attention to the ball. How many times did they pass it? And then afterwards it says, did you notice the gorilla? And then they show you it and you're like, is that really there? And you rewind it back and you didn't even notice it. It's just like there are certain things that they keep your attention on something, but don't you think the word public relations, like it's a bit of a pipe dream? I mean, it comes off with the guise of like we're here for your best interests, but it's like, but what interests are those? And it's like, are you just assuming my interests are the same interest in your values? Like, I'm very skeptical when it comes to everything. It's not that I just believe everything's a lie. It's just I kind of look at it like, okay, but what's the real incentive to this, or what's the real incentive to that? I think like, I mean, a lot of times people were like Adkins, the health diet trend. That guy comes on stage. I'm a doctor. I know what you should eat to lose weight and lose fat. And then, it turned out to be a lie. He was like, what is it? Don't eat fat. Fat's bad for you. And it turns out it's sugar. And then you learn about the sugar industry that was manipulating media studies. And you're like, okay, so what? You thought he was public relations.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think Bernays was very astute to come up with a term that was different from propaganda. Did he think that public relations was something much purer than propaganda? I don't think he believed that for 1 second, and he continued to engage in the most devious and deceptive practices on behalf of both his corporate and his political clients in the succeeding decades. One can understand that all organizations have a perfectly defensible need and right to employ professionals who can advise about how best to promote a particular company and the various interests that it represents. And they would doubtless argue that they can do this without lying, by focusing on things that are true and always being highly positive about their client and promoting their client's best interests in ways that they will claim to be very ethical. And I think a large part of public relations is probably not too far off that reasonably that pragmatic model. We all have to communicate to one another. Corporations have to communicate to the rest of the world and to their various stakeholders. And of course, there are many reasons why they would want to do that in the most professional and efficient ways. I don't see that as a bad thing. I think when it becomes problematic is that when the message that they are communicating is based on things that are untrue, is based on the interests of a few that run against the interests of the majority, and that have unhealthy consequences and implications for the world in general. Then I think we're definitely moving into the era of propaganda. So a classic example that comes to my mind is the role of Hill and Knowlton. So what a pillar of the public relations establishment back in the this is in the late 1980s, early 1990s. It has since become quite notorious as for its taking on of political campaigns that have impacts in the realm of foreign policy. So back in 1991, there was the crisis that we had with Iraq, and Saddam Hussein was promising to invade Kuwait, or was threatening to invade Kuwait, and the US was going to take him on, although it gave him, having given him the green light more or less, privately decided that they would take Saddam Hussein on. The American public couldn't give a damn. They didn't know where Kuwait was. They had no reason why they had no reason to think that it was in America's interest to stop Saddam Hussein taking over Kuwait. Oil, of course, a significant oil producer, as Iraq was as well. Kuwait, a few decades earlier, had been part of Iraq anyway, but it was the British who decided to separate Kuwait off from the rest of Iraq, because they knew that it would be helpful to their interests ultimately to be able to play Kuwait against Iraq and to promote special relations.
It's
Yeah.
similar to the Holocaust. We didn't get involved into all that, and we knew it was going on a little bit before we eventually stepped into it, but we only got involved when we were dragged in a sense. When we looked at, I think all the United Forces kind of looked at this aspect of like, hey, this is going to be somebody that's going to take over everything, so we might as well step in now, and that's when we got involved.
Yeah. So anyway, Hill and Knowlton came up with this idea. They concocted a story about how Saddam Hussein's soldiers in Kuwait City had gone into the hospitals and searched for babies in incubators. and they took the babies out of the incubators and left the babies on the stone cold floor, is the expression that the one witness used, leaving these poor babies on the stone cold floor of the hospitals to then to rob to take away the incubators and to send those incubators back to Iraq. This story was taken at face value on the basis of just one witness who was coached by Hill and Knowlton before a congressional hearing organized by Hill and Knowlton, and who turned out to be, although this was not known at the time, who turned out to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to Washington. The likelihood of this girl, she was 15 years old, the likelihood of her actually being in Kuwait at that time with the presence of Iraqi soldiers in Kuwaiti city, I've always thought was in itself highly unlikely. The story that she told was picked up by the media, was picked up at the White House. President Bush Sr. Referred to this story multiple times in various speeches, trying to drum up support for U.S. action against Iraq. And ultimately, this campaign managed to swing a very small vote in congressional vote in favor of U.S. action to stop Saddam Hussein. So is at that point that this is a very interesting illustration of the role of mainstream public relations in actually promoting. By the way, this story fell apart completely as soon as the war was over. The whole babies being thrown out of incubators was found to be almost wholly untrue, if not totally untrue.
Well, people went blind with rage when they saw the baby thing. It's whenever something gets mentioned with kids, it's like an immediate trigger for, even if I don't have kids, but as soon as I hear something like that, I immediately was shocked and horror. Then I had to remember, wait a minute, this was propaganda. Like you could tell, like, oh, they stole the incubators, but they left the babies on the floor. It was like, all right, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But it's that babies factor where anybody, it doesn't matter if you just have a heart and you know something that can't protect itself on its own or needs assistance, you just immediately get angry. And it's like, that riles everybody. I mean, that's still a trigger point today. I mean, I'd ask you the question, do you blame more of the propaganda or the reliance of media to reduce their propaganda? Or do you just think that people should be, I guess, more cautious in what they kind of view? I kind of hold the aspect of like when I hear something, I have to go to multiple sources to be able to verify if that's just not a narrative being pitched. And that's kind of why I have my show set up to talk to all sides of everything. Cause, you know, you can get a sales pitch really, really well, but I don't know if I should blame people for that. I mean, I guess so, but also, I mean, there's a problem with media pitching a narrative too.
Yeah. Well, I don't regard the media, particularly here in the United States, but pretty much this is true everywhere you go in the world. The media, even when they, or perhaps particularly when the media boast of their own independence, then you have to run to the bathroom to vomit because the media are very rarely independent in any meaningful sense. You see most of our mainstream media in this country, they are component parts, sometimes quite small component parts of huge industrial and corporate interests who have a very strong interest in the status quo and have very powerful, well-oiled relationships with the main political parties and with the military-industrial machine of the United States. It's very, very rare indeed to see U.S. media covering any international conflict from anything other than a basic presumption that the U.S. is right. The U.S. perspective, the official Washington narrative is the right narrative. And in telling that narrative, they will frequently ally themselves with these kind of public relations campaigns or propaganda campaigns that I've recently referred to, and they will weaponize small babies, and they'll weaponize women, and they'll weaponize photos of attractive young people protesting, whether it's Tahrir Square or anything else, so long as it promotes the Washington narrative, which is usually that this regime is awful, we want to see this regime removed, and we want to see a new regime that will be much more compliant with US business, corporate, and political interest. So I would say that we're seeing this story right now, and yet again, it never ends. It's always the same cycle with respect to how the media are covering the current riots in Iran. We saw it endlessly with respect to the pretexts that we gave for our invasion and 20-year occupation of Afghanistan, at the end of which the position of women, I think, in Afghanistan is still a great deal worse than it was before, even before the Soviet invasion back in 1979. Yeah, we can feel sorry, and it goes remind me too of the use of totally fabricated narratives about how German soldiers, this is in the lead up to World War One, the Western media were relaying stories about German soldiers killing and eating babies. So that's just a perfectly natural thing for any decent German soldier to want to do. And of course, total rubbish. But that's the kind of thing that has worked in the past, and with a little bit more subtlety tends to, still to work today. We use stories of babies, we use stories of young people and women to promote quite different agendas that have absolutely got nothing to do with women's rights or anything else other than the spread of a neoliberal agenda for a neoliberal world order.
Do you think that the propaganda machine not only fuels the people, but the people also fuel the propaganda machine? We got lucky with the Hill, and I think even then they still have some problems. They back out back and forth, but the two co-hosts, one's a Democrat and one's a Republican. So they kind of balance each other out and kind of give you a balanced medium in a sense. It kind of attracts two different fields of audiences, which is different from the mainstream news. But even then they have like these fights back and forth where the show ends for a while and they have to come back. But when it comes to the people fueling the propaganda machine, the propaganda fueling the people, I mean, look, we got out of Afghanistan, and that was a long ass fucking time. We were over there. Pardon my French, but we shouldn't have been over there. And it was a waste of money. It was a waste of a bunch of things. But then you look at what happened with Ukraine, and what was the first thing people wanted? You got to go over there and you got to do something. It was like, no, we need to take a seat on the bench. And that's an unpopular opinion, but in a sense, we do. It's like this back and forth. It's like, if we're involved in something, people want us out. And then if we get involved or we get out of something, people want us involved in something. And it's like this whole, like, we're fueling the machine's fueling us. And maybe it's their reporting that's brainwashing us. And at the same time, maybe it's us that's fueling their reporting. When they see people are watching the television talking about Ukraine, they start reporting more on Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a good point. A chicken and egg argument. However, I think I'm inclined, however, to think that ultimately there is a causality. There is a linearity to this. So let's take the example of Ukraine. Excuse me. I wrote a book, by the way, on the media coverage of the 2014 crisis, and what seems pretty much self-evident to me is that if there is an instinctive public reaction in favor of Ukraine in this conflict between Ukraine and Russia, which I actually prefer to regard as a proxy war between NATO and Russia, but if there is a sort of instinctive public sentiment in support of Ukraine, I think that is the result not of an immediate pro-Ukraine propaganda machinery, although that exists and did exist back before February 2022. But it goes back to multiple anti-Russian propaganda campaigns, each building on the other, each weaponizing, each making use of a pre-existing campaign. And this goes back, I got to say, it goes back to the Napoleonic invasion of Russia back in the early 1800s. I think it goes through the British provocations that led to the Crimean War in the 1850s. Of course, it has to do with Western horror and concern with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1916 and the efforts of Russia and Britain, sorry, the efforts of the United States and Britain and other Western powers to decimate or to overthrow the Bolshevik regime with their support for the so-called White Russian armies up to and including the early 1920s, trying to kill the communist baby in its first few months of life, so to speak. And then it goes on ever more. It goes through to the Stalin pact with Hitler in 1939, although, of course, Stalin does join our side a year later. But then, so very, very quickly, we move into the Cold War. So if you, my point is this, that anti-Russian sentiment is something that has been propagandized, it's been weaponized by Western interests, imperial and monarchical and corporate and business related, as always, that stretches back 200 years or more. So when you find popular support for Ukraine in the latest instance, the latest moment of this ever-ending, infinite narrative of conflict between the two powers, it's because they've been breathing this. They've been breathing this propaganda pollution, the polluted air of propaganda. They've been breathing it since almost the day that they were born. They don't have access to any alternative narrative, and that is a great success from the point of view of the propagandists, that they have so monopolized the narrative that people can no longer imagine that there is possibly a different way of reading it. The media help through systematic lack of professionalism. Now, I say that, so the example I would give in the context of Ukraine is it would make perfectly good sense, wouldn't it, to, if you were truly concerned to educate and to help your audience understand the significance of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February this year. It would make help to understand. It would to help people understand this. The obvious thing to do is go back at least as far as 2014 and to talk openly and critically and without shame or embarrassment or without feeling that you're going to annoy someone in Washington. Talk openly about Washington's support for the coup d'etat, which occurred in the Maidan protests in Kiev in 2000, from the end of 2013 through to the early months of 2014. This is a coup d'etat which brings to power a regime that does not have majority support across Ukraine. It probably doesn't even have 50% support across Ukraine. Why? Because Ukraine is at least two different countries, one of which is strongly pro-Russian. These are the eastern oblasts, and the other is much more European looking, and which, by the way, was also the center for the German occupation of Ukraine during World War II, and the center for Ukraine's own homegrown versions of Nazism through Stepan Bandera and other right-wing figures from that period. That they're all strongly Western Ukrainian. So we've got a country that, as I say, is made up of at least two different elements. That regime in 2014 that came about as a result of the street protests in Maidan, which weren't even genuine protests. They started off as genuine protests, but then they were hijacked by right sector and other sort of Stepan Bandera associated neo-Nazi movements, who through the use of force and through the use, and I believe this is now well attested to through the empirical evidence, through the systematic massacre by the rebel-associated forces, the right-wing forces, of innocent protesters in the streets. Hundreds were shot, and they were shot primarily not, as the propaganda would have it, not by the forces of the regime, but by the forces of the right-wing movements that had hijacked the protests. Whether you, I will argue that this narrative is broadly correct and is empirically supported, but you don't necessarily have to accept that without and still see that this is a highly contested narrative. That the conflict of 2022 didn't just spring from nowhere. It came about as a result, in part, as a result of the 2014 coup d'état, which was followed almost immediately by an actual war in Ukraine with his own people. That is to say, a war between Kiev, the Kiev regime, by the way, a regime which didn't even have the confidence to allow the existing political parties to vote in the elections, which supposedly gave legitimacy to the coup, to the forces of the coup. They criminalized membership of, for example, membership of the Party of the Regions, which was the largest single political party in Ukraine up to the time of the coup itself. What kind of legitimacy do you get from a regime that has to criminalize the one main political party? It doesn't make any sense, and it still doesn't make any sense. And
I'm
then
not going to be able to make sense out of the Ukraine issue, but that's an issue that I definitely can see pre-motive there for sure.
what I'm saying, I guess, Robbie, is that the one of the principal forms of propaganda that we encounter in the Western mainstream media, the news media, is they don't tell us the full story. They tell us a story that sort of begins, in this instance, it begins in February 2022. If you don't know that there's a very complex prior history, you understand nothing. And yet this is constantly the complaint that I have about mainstream media coverage. They simply forget history, or they start the story at a time that's convenient to the forces that be in Washington.
The second point makes way more sense than the first one. I don't think they forget. I think they just choose to leave those details out because they know what propagandizes people. But do you?
Of course.
I'll ask you this one last question. But do you think that propaganda will ever be something that will just go away and we'll never have to deal with it, or do you think this is just gonna? It's like Pandora's box. This is just something we're just going to have to be a part of, probably for the rest of our lives.
Yes, I think almost certainly the latter, because as a species, we are very divided by different interests and different cultures, and different cultures value different things, etc., and so forth. So conflict is not going to disappear ever, and so long as there's conflict, then there are going to be conflicting narratives, conflicting explanations, conflicting pretexts for why human beings do what they do. And because media have been invented, media are not going to go away anyway either. Then it's inevitable that both propaganda and propaganda through media will persist. There are measures that we can take to ameliorate the situation. So, for example, we can struggle to create new media forms that are not that are clearly independent.
I'm trying my hardest. I'm trying my hardest.
Yes, people like you, Robbie, and since you make that very important point, it's also absolutely necessary to acknowledge and to recognize that for all the horrors, if you will, of the social media and the very close ties that we now see between the principal digital platforms and the national security establishment, all these big guys, the Facebooks and the Googles and the Apples, they all have very, very solid ties to the national security establishment, and they work for the national security establishment. So there's no reason, therefore, to imagine that their contents, therefore, will be totally unaffected by this integration between the main platforms and the principal powers that be. But nonetheless, the social media has greatly expanded this space, this possibility for dissent, for different views. And every time that they try to close these up, well, inventive people like yourself find somewhere else to do this and to make this kind of conversation possible. So yeah, so it is not by no means is it a pessimistic story. And sometimes the one pearl can shine bright in a sea of gray stones. In other words, it's not always a matter of quantity. What matters is quality. A quality message, and I think JFK was an example of that. If we go back to that movie, is a strong quality product that was not telling a narrative that was comfortable for the establishment. So long as we have the white pearls, the gleaming white pearls in these seas of gray muck, I think that we got reason to think that we will in the end of the day be okay, because human beings can be reached by good argument, by strong and genuine passion. Their minds can be changed, and their leaders can see that and try to take account of the fact that they need to come up with somewhat better and more convincing narratives, preferably through actions that lead to positive change.
I think the easiest thing to do as people is just have a conversation. Like I've heard so much about Islam, but then when I spoke to someone about the Ottoman Empire and he showed me his perspective and he was Islamic, it's just like you start thinking about things differently. And it's like you understand conversation can solve more than the platforms that we have in this country that are called debates. And it's like that's how our political system is kind of running as a show of making fun of each other. You expect real decisions to actually get made when whoever's elected in there. And I think, talking to so many people, you get that. And I'm not an independent source that's gonna, shine better than anybody else. But I just think that more people spend time, you find things you like, but also look at the things you might be interested in. And think the internet's given the platform. There's over like 5 million or 2 million something podcasts out there that have various different topics, true crime and all that. And I think that's important. And plus I get to meet cool people like yourself, which is, a pat on my back. But Oliver, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk, man. Is there a place where people can find your books and any other links you'd like to promote as well too?
Principally Substack, so Oliver Boyd-Barrett at substack.com, I think it is. That'll find me.
Okay. And I'm gonna link.
And thank you so much, Robbie, for this opportunity.
Yep. Thank you, Oliver. And I'm gonna link all your links in the description, man. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks for listening to this episode. By the